On March 17, 1862, a massive armada of transports with every kind imaginable set sail from Alexandria, Virginia, located 6 miles from Washington, D.C. This armada transported over 120,000 men, 15,000 horses, 1,500 wagons, and 44 artillery units, along with the massive amount of material and supplies that accompany such a force. This was the beginning of the Peninsula Campaign, and the aim of this campaign was rather simple: take the Confederate capital at Richmond. This operation's original goal had been to use the Rappahannock River and to land at a town called Urbana on the south side of that river. Thus, McClellan would have interposed his army between Joe Johnston's army and Richmond, allowing him to get at Richmond without having to attack through the heavily fortified Confederate positions at Manassas. However, earlier that month, before the Union operation had begun, Confederate forces abandoned the Manassas fortifications to set up defenses along the Rappahannock River, with their headquarters at Fredericksburg. This would allow them to be more easily supplied from Richmond, and coincidentally would stop McClellan from doing exactly what he meant to. With his original target now invalid, Lincoln encouraged McClellan to abandon his overseas plans and pursue the Confederate army overland. However, McClellan and most of his generals still favored an overseas invasion around the main Confederate lines, this time to land on the Virginia Peninsula and take Richmond from behind. Faced with this, Lincoln acquiesced to the collective opinion of his military officers. McClellan used Fort Monroe, a coastal fort on the tip of the Virginia Peninsula that had remained in Union hands, as the primary point of disembarkation, and began the process of bringing troops and supplies ashore to allow his army to advance. The Union Army spent the next fortnight disembarking this massive force, while the Confederate forces, lacking the strength to attack the Union Army at their disembarkation point, and lacking the naval strength to seriously disrupt landing, busily readied their defensive works in preparation to repel the enemy. On April 4th, the Union Army finally began its advance up the peninsula. There were a number of places that had to be secured en route to allow McClellan's forces to approach Richmond, and in this regard the first day of the advance went well for the Union. Confederate forces abandoned their defensive works at Big Bethel and Young's Mill without a fight, but things changed radically on April 5th. Confederate General Magruder and his 13,000 men stood their ground near Yorktown and established a defensive line anchored by the York River to the north and the James River to the south, and with the much smaller Warwick River to their front. Although the Warwick River was rather small and did not run along the whole length of the Confederate defensive line, it was sufficient to limit the routes that the advancing Union forces could take, thus making Magruder's position far more defensible. However, even with these advantages, Magruder had far too few men to hold against McClellan. Magruder's and Richmond's only hope was to delay McClellan long enough for Joe Johnston to bring the necessary reinforcements. Desperate to cause even the slightest delay in the enemy's advance, Magruder spread his artillery far apart, firing sporadically, and marched companies of men back and forth across his line, thus creating the appearance that he had a much larger force at his disposal than he truly did. Aiding in his deception was the fact that McClellan had also received extremely faulty information regarding the enemy's troop strength that made him believe he was facing an army of 100,000, when in actuality he was facing a force of barely 13,000, who had been spread across a defensive line that they had no hope of holding if McClellan had attacked. Thus, McClellan decided to delay his attack in favor of a siege, and constructed batteries in preparation to use his superior artillery to bombard the enemy out of their position. Meanwhile, Magruder's position was reinforced by Johnston and the army from Fredericksburg through the month of April, and he further established fortifications, only redoubling McClellan's resolve to siege instead of attacking directly. Even as the siege drug on day after day, McClellan never discovered how small the force opposing him truly was. His anxiety over troop strength had only been worsened because of Abraham Lincoln's decision to withhold McDowell's First Corps of 30,000 men for the purpose of defending Washington, D.C., in fear that the Confederacy might take advantage of the Union Army's absence and attack the capital. This decision, much like McClellan's own original decision to siege and delay his attack, was the result of seriously faulty intelligence regarding the enemy troop strength. Now believing that artillery was the only way to drive the Confederates from their fortifications, McClellan was frustrated with the Navy's refusal to provide heavy fire against the Yorktown defenses. This refusal was because of the fear that the iron warship, the CSS Virginia, might take the opportunity to destroy the Union ships while they bombarded these targets. With McClellan's lack of confidence in the success of a frontal assault, The siege came to drag on for almost a month until May 3rd. By then, Union artillery had been brought up and placed in superior positions for a massive artillery bombardment, but to McClellan's surprise the enemy withdrew the day before the bombardment was supposed to begin. The Confederate army, which over the course of the siege had been reinforced to number at 51,000 men under Joe Johnston, retreated up the peninsula towards Richmond. McClellan was caught totally off guard by the sudden retreat, as he still believed that the Confederate army which he had been facing was much more powerful than it actually was. He attempted to intercept the retreating force by sending his own forces in pursuit, while sending Brigadier General William Franklin's division by boat up the York River to Ethlam's Landing. From there it was hoped that they could disrupt the Confederate retreat long enough to allow McClellan's pursuing army to engage them. However, the departure of Franklin's division was delayed by 2 whole days because of the difficulties of loading the required force. Even after they arrived at Ethlam's Landing on the night of May 6th, they were still too late to support the pursuit force that had already been engaged by Confederate Major General James Longstreet in the Battle of Williamsburg the previous day, where he had held the Union off long enough to allow the main army to get away. Even so, Franklin hoped to still do some damage to the enemy's retreat, but on May 7th, Franklin's division was engaged by 2 brigades under the command of General John Bell Hood and General William Whiting, who forced them to retreat back into the river. Thus, the Confederate forces fell back to Richmond, burning bridges behind them to slow the Union advance. Now at the very gates of the capital, Joe Johnston, with his army of 60,000, tried to devise a way to save Richmond from a force twice their size. Despite the excellent performance of the Confederate army thus far, and the Union invasion's many setbacks, it appears now that they had only delayed their final defeat. They had thus far failed to push back, let alone destroy the advancing Union army, and had lost the entire peninsula, and with it the port city of Norfolk, which was abandoned on May 9th. The CSS Virginia, with its home port about to fall and an impassable Federal blockade at sea, was destroyed by her crew, who had rather burn their own ship than let her fall into enemy hands. The situation for the Union was very different. Although things had not gone entirely to plan, McClellan was quite pleased with himself. He avoided fighting a pitched battle at Yorktown for the land he had taken thus far, but he had done so at a great expense in time. Because of these delays, he now faces the main Confederate army in an entrenched position, which is what he had been trying to avoid by launching the seaborne invasion. He also has President Lincoln on his back, criticizing his slow advance as the result of a lack of initiative. Despite these circumstances, Richmond was now in sight, and Lincoln had finally released McDowell's corps to him, which marched through the now abandoned Manassas defenses and crossed the Rappahannock through Fredericksburg, now undefended as those troops had been sent to Richmond. Still uncertain of the enemy's strength, and with victory in sight, he refused to abandon his customary caution, and settled in for a siege, trusting that a general bombardment by his artillery and from the navy, now rid of the CSS Virginia, would destroy the city and the enemy army defending it. Realizing that he has no hope of holding the city in the face of a Union siege and superior artillery, General Johnston decided to attack the Union army. Because of the ground around Richmond, and the route of the Richmond-York Railroad that the Union was being supplied from, McClellan was forced to deploy his army with the Chickahominy River running between it. Despite having built a number of hastily constructed bridges to link the divided army, any serious movement of troops from one side of the river to the other would be slowed. This gave Johnston the opportunity to attack one half of the army, while reinforcements from the other half were delayed. Having learned that the First Corps would be rejoining McClellan's army from the north, Johnston decided to attack the north side of the Chickahominy River before those additional troops arrived, and the attack was scheduled for May 27th. On the day of the attack, a battle had taken place north of Richmond near Hanover County Courthouse between a small Confederate force and a much larger Union force. McClellan believed that the Confederate force, which numbered to be about 4,000 men, was actually a larger force that was intent on threatening the First Corps' advance towards Richmond. Thus, he sent his Fourth Corps to push them out of the way, and despite success was very wary of enemy activities on the north side of the river. This caused Joe Johnston to delay his attack, and news arrived later that same day that the First Corps had been again diverted away from McClellan by the Lincoln administration to the Shenandoah Valley because of Stonewall Jackson's recent victory there in the First Battle of Winchester. With these new considerations in mind, Johnston devised a new plan that called for most of his army, some 51,000 men, to attack the 3rd and 4th Union Corps with a total of about 33,000 men on the southern side of the river on the 31st of May. The night before, heavy wind and rain had done damage to both sides' plans, as they had caused the roads that the Confederate army intended to advance on to become very muddy and difficult to traverse, and had destroyed many of the Union's bridges. The battle, which because of constraints on time I cannot go into detail about, went poorly for the Confederates. The plan called for the annihilation of these two corps by overwhelming force, but confusion in the attack caused the Confederate advance to stall. Despite this, the Confederates continued the assault with modest success for the whole first day and through the morning of the second. By then, however, it became apparent that the original goal of the attack was impossible, as these corps had gotten significant reinforcements from the north side of the river. The battle ended with about 5,000 Union casualties and about 6,100 Confederate casualties. The most significant event of the battle occurred at night between the first and second day, when Joe Johnston was struck by a Minié ball in the right shoulder and then by a piece of artillery shell in the chest, and was wounded seriously, rendering him unable to resume command. With Johnston out of the fight, Confederate President Jefferson Davis chose to place his military advisor Robert E. Lee in command of the Army of Virginia in the defense of Richmond. Outnumbered, with the Union Army just 6 miles outside the city, Robert E. Lee had inherited command of an army that had struggled to hold the line against what seemed to be an invincible Federal force. Despite these circumstances, Lee remained confident he could repel the Union invasion. He instantly set to work preparing to draw in more reinforcements, convinced, like Johnston was, that to hold the city against such superior artillery would invite defeat. Lee prepared to move Jackson's entire force out of the Shenandoah Valley, as well as drawing troops from every conceivable source to reinforce his army for the offensive. On June 10th, General Lee summoned the commander of the Army's Cavalry Brigade, and former student of his at West Point, Jeb Stuart, to discuss a possible cavalry mission. Following the previous battle, McClellan shifted most of his troops south of the Chickahominy, leaving a smaller force on the north side. General Lee revealed to General Stuart that he intended to launch a major attack on these remaining Union troops and would require detailed information about how far out the Union watch outposts extended. This was necessary so that Lee could plan a surprise attack without alerting McClellan of the Confederate troops' movements on the north side of the river. General Stuart instantly realized the possible benefits, both militarily and personally, to elevating the mission of reconnaissance into something greater. He suggested that he take a cavalry force of some 1,200 men and go all the way around the Union forces north of the river, cross the river, and then proceed around the remainder of the enemy army re-entering Richmond from the south, scouting the enemy, destroying telegraph wires, and destroying or capturing supplies all along the way. Lee approved, and the raid set out at 2 a.m. on June 12th. It would meet with massive success, and over the course of 2 days it would take 165 prisoners, capture 260 horses and mules, cause several $1 million worth in damage, and force the Union to divert many troops away from main lines and defense communication and supply routes, all at the loss of one Confederate soldier. Now confident he could provide a great victory for the Confederacy, 10 days after Jeb Stuart returned to Richmond on June 24th, Lee sent his plan of attack in General Order No. 75 to his commanders. His army would attack the remaining Union troops north of the Chickahominy. This action would be supported by Stonewall Jackson's force, which had left the Shenandoah to support this attack. And Lee's own army had been swollen by drawing from every source of troops possible, giving Lee 92,000 men to work with. Having secured this side of the river, the Confederate Army would sever McClellan's supply line, which depended almost exclusively on the Richmond-York Railroad line to supply 600 tons of food and supplies that they consumed every day. If McClellan lost this railroad, he would have to break the siege and retreat to the coast where the Navy could supply his forces. This plan, however, presented serious risks to the Confederate Army and Richmond. The whole Confederate Army would be busy north of the river, and Lee would leave only 25,000 men to defend Richmond. If the attack went poorly, or McClellan realized the Confederates' vulnerability, he could take Richmond with ease. The attack was scheduled for June 26th, and coincidentally the day before McClellan launched a small attack against Richmond's defenses. This cautious attack gained little ground, and only 2 divisions of Union forces were involved. They made insignificant gains, all of which would be lost to them the next day. Although this battle, called the Battle of Oak Grove, had little consequence, it is counted as the first of the 7 days' battles. The day of the 26th began badly for Lee. Stonewall's force was to play a critical role in that battle, as it was expected that his 18,000 men attacking the Union position from the north would be what assured victory. However, morning became afternoon, and Jackson's force, which was expected to arrive on the day of the attack, was nowhere to be seen. Fearing that McClellan might notice that the Confederate army was deployed north of the river and that his element of surprise would be lost, Lee ordered the attack to commence. 3 divisions, a total of 40,000 men, attacked, but the attack failed to push the Union out of their entrenched positions. Despite this, McClellan fears that he is being assaulted by a much larger force than he actually is, and orders his troops to fall back towards the river, thus ending the Battle of Mechanicsville, so named because of the town near the Union defensive works. By the morning of the 27th, Jackson had arrived, and Lee ordered Jackson to take his army east, around the Union line, to the crossroads at Old Cold Harbor, and attack their right flank, while A.P. Hill attacks their left. Lee hopes he will thus trap the Union force against the Chickahominy River, denying it the ability to defend its railroad further east. However, Jackson again errs, and heads to New Cold Harbor. He realizes the mistake, but by then he has marched for miles in the wrong direction. Despite the fact that he has no way of stopping the Union force from retreating further east towards the railroad, Lee attacks anyway, and the battle begins at 2:30 p.m. There is heavy fighting through that day, and the Confederates manage to gain some ground, but the fall of night leaves the Union largely in the same location. Unbeknownst to Lee, McClellan had thrown himself into a panic and believes he is now being assaulted by the impossible number of 200,000 Confederate troops. McClellan had decided before the battle began to break the siege and abandon the railroad, so he could retreat to the James River, where he could be supplied by sea and retreat to it if necessary. At the same time the battle was taking place, much of the Confederate army began marching towards the James River, using the battle on the north side of the Chickahominy as a rearguard action. At first, Lee believed McClellan was sending troops east to protect his supply line. Lee ordered that the forces in Richmond under General Magruder attempt cautious reconnaissance in force to determine the details on this move, but that reconnaissance in force turned into a small battle when a Brigadier General Toombs became overzealous and attempted to attack Union forces. This battle was later called the Battle of Garnett's Farm, and although Toombs' men were easily beaten off, it convinced McClellan that he was being attacked on all sides, further increasing his anxiety. By night, McClellan withdraws the Union force north of the river, thus ending the Battle of Gaines' Mill, so named because of the mill where the first skirmishing of that day had begun. Lee and his officers were stunned by this, but Lee quickly sprang into action, hoping to cut off the Federal army and annihilate it. That day was mostly spent maneuvering, as Lee brought his army across the Chickahominy to give pursuit to the enemy. McClellan personally rode ahead to Malvern Hill, where he considered taking up positions, but did so leaving most of his army behind him. The corps commanders had not been given orders about what routes to take for the retreat, and McClellan had left without naming somebody to command the retreat. All during that day, huge plumes of smoke were seen from the former Union lines, as rearguard units burned all the supplies that could not be taken with them. Also abandoned were 2,500 wounded, who were left in the makeshift hospitals for the Confederates to take care of. Needless to say, Union morale was plummeting as they gave up the land they had been trying to take since March. The rapidly pursuing Confederate force fought a Union rearguard action at Savage's Station on the 29th, where Union forces were slowed because of the nearby White Oak Swamp. Stonewall Jackson had again delayed, as he was trying to rebuild bridges over the Chickahominy so his men could cross with greater ease. He later received garbled instructions from Lee's chief of staff that made him believe General Lee desired for him to remain there to defend those crossings. Without Jackson, Magruder and his 14,000 men couldn't break through Union General Sumner's 26,000 men. The fighting ended in a stalemate and the Union army escaped. More rearguard actions were fought on June 30th at the battles of White Oak Swamp and Glendale, but it is sufficient to say of these that the Union retreat was mostly successful, and Lee never managed to destroy any large portion of the Federal army as he had hoped. The final battle of the 7 days was at Malvern Hill, where Lee attempted one last time to damage the Union army. However, the Union artillery had been massed there, and the attack turned into a bloodbath. Now at the James River, the Union army had all the artillery of the Navy to protect it, and Lee desisted from further attacks. Believing he is impossibly outnumbered, McClellan re-embarks his troops and returns to Washington. Despite suffering heavy casualties, 19,000 in all, out of which 3,494 were killed, Lee had performed better than the Confederate government or Jefferson Davis could have hoped for. Richmond was saved, and the largest army ever fielded by the United States government up to that date had fled into the sea. The Army of Northern Virginia had gained immense renown overnight, and the Union staggered back in shock at their defeat. The public would turn angry eyes to Lincoln, who in turn would turn angry eyes to McClellan, who was fired after this failure, but Lee was not satisfied. He would go on to write, "Our success has not been as great or complete as we should have desired. Under ordinary circumstances, the Federal army should have been utterly destroyed. Indeed, had Lee achieved such a goal, extraordinary even for that legendary man, it is likely that the war would have ended. The Union, with its principal fighting force gone, would struggle to defend Washington, and Lee's marches into the North would have been far more likely to end in success. This opportunity to annihilate the Federal army would never again present itself to Lee, and despite his many future successes, his enemy's escape from the gates of Richmond would ensure that the war drug on, eventually to Lee's defeat." However, even dissatisfied with his victory, he had earned the love and affection of his country, his state, and the men under his command, and would be looked to as the champion of the new War of Independence in the era of George Washington.